本人の日本精神というものをこういう点も学び取ろうというのが一つの目的のようでしたね。
非常に熱心にもう普通の人の日本人の人の3倍も4倍も時間をかけてねやっていますね。
結局ね、武道というものはやっぱり本当の精神面ですからね、やる心だけでもね、だけどもそれにはやっぱり実際にね、切れないかななんて考えてしまうと結局なんです。だから精神が統一をしてね、スパーッとやってしまうというところがね、やはり実際の東方なんですよ。
Yes, so when I was 10, my father died, and a year later my mother had a very serious nervous breakdown. My outlook was conditioned by that, so I was looking for answers to why I'd been plunged into this black hole. Then I came across a monk or an Anglican priest who was in a monastic order, who had set up a community to explore the use of Oriental meditation techniques in a Christian context. So from the age of 15, I was going to visit this community, and when I graduated, I went initially to spend a couple of years, and I said a bit longer. They had run a lot of missions in India, and this particular priest had decided maybe there could be some benefit in a two-way exchange, and had spent a lot of time and effort exploring yoga, meditation.
What shape did life in a monastery take?
So you have the Benedictine rules, so you have these offices, these prayers at set times during the day, 5 or 6 times during the day. And then we had periods of meditation. We had various kinds of moving meditation. So we did one which was based on holding yoga poses. We did quite a bit of Tai Chi. There was a very good Chinese teacher who was visiting the monastery. So the day was built around those different practices. And we also had 2 periods of work. So there were various craft shops. I was trained as a potter. And then there was a large market garden. So that kind of made up the schedule of the day. Initially, I went to Japan because I was interested in looking more into the meditation traditions, and specifically Zen meditation. I wanted to study acupuncture and various therapeutic, which I'd done also a little bit in the monastery. I was introduced to a monk in Japan. He did this kind of alarming demonstration. It was all very melodramatic. This is at 12 o'clock at night. He opened the glass doors of his little Japanese hut. He had these lights set up in his garden, which was set up against this cliff face, and started spinning around with his metal. He gave me a bokken, a wooden sword, and said, "Look, try swinging it." I was very resistant to getting involved in it, but this man was very impressive. I mean, he had a most amazing physique and an amazing sharpness of mind. I felt I had to give it a go. There is a contemplative tradition in Christianity, through the mystics, St. John of the Cross, Julian of Norwich, somebody like the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, and in particular the romantic poets. My subject at university was literature, and I was particularly drawn to William Blake and the Romantic poets. There's a very close connection between the approach to that kind of spirituality connected with nature. Even in India, you'll find that there are lots of Indian religious people will quote Wordsworth or Coleridge because they recognise the parallels. There's some suggestions that Blake studied some Indian sources. The philosophy he arrived at is remarkably close to the what's called in Japan the Mikkyo, or the Vajrayana, the Tantric Buddhist system, which is the system which is closest as a kind of spiritual source to the Japanese sword systems. That system and its approach to the way the mind works, and especially the creative imagination, is remarkably close to Blake's system. So his system of the four zoas, if you like, his mandala, because he created these various pictorial representations of this imaginative world that he had created, is very like the basic mandala of it's the same one in Tibet, so the Vajrayana tradition. And the approach, so a Buddhist doesn't believe in any gods, but uses gods within this context, these deities, recognizing their power as, if you like, psychological, psycho-spiritual entities that can be used to activate different parts of the mind that you want to engage with or gain control with or harmonize with. And if you read some of Blake's annotations and some of his kind of his philosophical, if you can call it that, philosophical expositions, he describes, almost identically the same sort of process. I'm sure that most people who wielded swords in Japan, their kind of knowledge of spirituality or their depth of practice was probably pretty shallow. And the same can be said for the situation now. So in Japan, there is a sort of a cultural recognition there's a kind of vocabulary of spirituality that everybody is familiar with. But if you try to find somebody that is actually existing in that reality, then they're very, very few and far between. People who've been to war, professional soldiers, after they've gone through all those experiences, one route out is to take a spiritual practice very seriously. There are other routes out. So if you're a sort of sociopath, psychopathic personality, no route is required, you just kind of carry on. But most other people, they will either completely repress all those experiences and all the traumatic after effects, or they take to drink or drugs in a big way. For people in that situation in Japan, there is a ready kind of pathway. They can go to a temple. So many of them they would go to a temple, become a monk. The most famous example is Miyamoto Musashi. Although he's not, he wouldn't be seen as a sort of one of the typical examples of a spiritual devotee. When he was 32, he'd killed 50 or 60 people in dueling, and he'd been to several important battles. But he realized that he didn't really know why that had happened. And he felt impelled to then begin training to understand what swordsmanship was about, which is a kind of remarkable sort of life trajectory. I've spent the last 2 or 3 years studying a lot of literature about, traumatic therapy. Initially because I know various people people that I teach, where I thought that kind of knowledge might help me to be a bit more, to make my teaching more productive. But what was very interesting was, in a lot of these therapeutic approaches, I started to see a lot more detail about ways in which to train the mind in order for the swordsmanship to become more complete or more integrated. There are two possible directions. So somebody like Musashi plunges into this world of his father was a sword teacher, but an abusive character. He became basically like a killing machine. And then at the end of that process, for whatever reason, he doesn't really fully explain it, he felt the need to explore what was going inside himself and use the swordsmanship or use that exploration to bring his swordsmanship to what he saw as a kind of a completion. In the case of, someone like me, for example, I have never killed anybody. For somebody who has not had those experiences, trying to understand what those experiences might be like is really crucial to pursuing a kind of swordsmanship which has a real meaning. Although the first teacher was a monk, one of the teachers he was very keen for me to go to study with was somebody who'd been a military combat instructor in the Second World War. This was another thing which I felt had huge resistance to. This was somebody who'd fought with the Japanese army in China and no doubt, if not participated in, had been on the edge of all kinds of horrific war crimes. There was something about this man that kind of had a huge sort of charisma, deep kind of charismatic connection that I felt almost instantly, which was a big surprise because I think this is, part of the kind of fascist underworld of Japan, which is, the tie-up between the police, the armed forces, the mafia, certain parts of the monastic institutions, is very, very strong movement. And he was definitely in it or on the edge of it. And yet there was a kind of huge kind of openness of mind and heart, which I hadn't found anywhere else. And over time, I began to see that there was a direct connection between this and the fact that he had actually fought with a sword. Several of his contemporaries, so his these close combat instructors, were then used as executioners. His close friends were executed at the end of the war because killing somebody with a sword was considered a war crime. But because he was particularly skilled with the sword, he'd been retained as an instructor and had not been sent off to do those things. So he felt that the sword had saved him, and so he would use the sword. He would make something positive of that as a way of repaying the debt he felt to his comrades who'd been killed, although they'd really only been doing, the same as him. And there is this terminology in Japanese of the Katsujin Ken, Satsujin Ken. So the Satsujin Ken is the Ken of killing, and the Katsujin Ken is the sword which brings life to people. It's part of this kind of culture but this man really embodied it. But because of his experiences, he also recognized that unless the Katsujin-ken, the life-giving sword, is based on the Satsujin-ken sword, so the sword that is actually used in killing in the space of life or death in combat, unless it partakes of that reality in a kind of substantial, meaningful way, it doesn't have very much to give in terms of bringing life to people. It just becomes a dance or a mechanical activity or a way of engaging your ego or whatever. If you've not been through the experience, and this is something that my master said in he said one book which we translate into English, which is the most important thing is the power of the imagination, which is where you get back to William Blake. You have to imaginatively recreate, to the best of your ability, something approximating to a touch of that reality. But I mean, there are other life experiences that will give you some dimension to it. So although I haven't been in combat, I've seen quite a bit of death, and I've had 3 experiences where I was very close to death, in which my mind and body reacted very, very differently. And that's another reason I'm interested in these sort of traumatic therapies. Therapy for people who've been traumatized, because they explore the way that the mind works in those situations. You can freeze, that's one response. I was on a plane in the 90s in Japan, and it was hijacked by a madman who then killed the pilot and attempted to crash land the plane, to fly it under the Rainbow Bridge in Tokyo Bay. I'd been asleep. I woke up when the passengers from the top of the jumbo jet were sent down, while the crew tried to break into the cockpit on the top deck. So it's briefly explained to me what was going on, that this man was in the cockpit, and very shortly after we started to do a steep dive, and I just froze. And in fact, the whole plane was completely quiet, except for one person who said he could see the leaves on the trees, which is how close we got. It was a record for a dive, which they actually pulled out of. And on another occasion, I was trying to get qualified as a snow and ice climber in order to go to the Antarctic. This was my first plan before I decided to go to the monastery, was to go to be a general assistant with the survey. And I was a very bad climber because, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, I was trying to do everything with my arms. And we were taking up this couloir, and we had to do this traverse, and I just kind of flailed across and didn't use my crampons, didn't use my boots, and just slid off, dropped down, held on the rope from the lead climber instructor at the top. So he pulled me up, and I got back onto the launch point, and by this stage my legs were shaking so badly, and I just threw myself. I just thought, anything is better. So a kind of total panicked, hysterical reaction. And then the third occasion was when I was in my 10 years before, when climbing in Scotland, or just sort of rambling, I fell off a cliff down into a mountain stream into what happened to be a whirlpool. It's a very, very bizarre situation. I mean, to have been, because it was quite small, to have landed in it. And I was being pulled round and down. And although a part of me was panicking, my legs started to kind of engage and trying to save me. and another part was really, really calm. And in a moment where I was actually unconscious, I managed to get out of the pull and come onto a shelf. And I had a kind of amazing, blissful 48 hours afterwards.
Not just complete calmness.
Complete calmness, yeah. So that's the kind of complete gamut of possible states that you get in when you are suddenly projected into this sort of extreme situation.
The second one is interesting, where you said that you almost hysterically threw yourself across the chasm, as it were. Some of the masters, they speak of this mindset, the old texts from the 16th and 17th centuries, where they're saying that somebody might come at you who is drunk or enraged or terrified, and they're amongst the most dangerous opponents because they'll do something suicidal and unexpected. They'll just throw themselves onto the point of your blade to try and land a blow on you.
Again, it's sort of speculation, but it seems highly likely to me that most people, 90% of people in those sorts of situations either freeze and become a kind of passive victim, or they kind of berserk in a kind of suicidal mania.
Or, and this is something that we sometimes read in the English texts, it's sometimes considered better to be brave than skilled. And I think what they're trying to say there is it's better in a situation like that to let the anger take hold of you and throw yourself at your opponent than to just stand still.
In Kendo, there is, in terms of the judging and the assigning of points, the question of whether the strike or the cut is authentic. One of the things they always used to do was look at the feet, because if the feet are involved, if the whole body's involved with the feet, then you've got full power into the technique. But the other thing which is more interesting to me is that the legs are connected to the lower part of the brain. There's freezing or hysteria or the ability to spontaneously and calmly respond is depending on how the limbic system, as it used to be called anyway, is being engaged. If the movement is something which is coming from the legs and is an integrated movement, that is the kind of movement that can be achieved that will, that will break through the sort of surface nervous disorder.
The movement of the legs is what does that.
Yeah, a movement that comes from the legs. There was a famous bout between two very senior kendo teachers, sensei, maybe the very early 20th century. And one man was making all the hits, but they were being given equal applause. What was it that this other man was being given points for? There are two key terms used in particularly sword arts in Japan. One is zanshin. So zanshin means, a very rough translation would be composure. And then the other is kihaku, which is related to sort of like kiai, which is power, or kigurai, which is presence or intent. So to the observers of that time, in that culture, with that kind of approach, the one who was scoring all the points was showing great intent, technical skill, but the other one was showing great composure and presence. To my mind, one aspect of that is the one who's showing the intent and the composure is the one who's showing that they would have been one in a real situation. I mean, it's the same with all conscript armies. You have this kind of syllabus, very basic kind of syllabus, which you've got to try and turn the crowd into some kind of military unit. The syllabus that was devised for the teaching of the use of the Japanese sword, people have to learn to be able to deal this decisive blow. They have to learn to be able to throw everything into this cut in order to overcome themselves and their enemy. That seems to me, well, I mean, you talked about it as well. That seems to me the in terms of a real situation, that is the most important thing. And as you said, you have to emphasize a mindset as part of the training, and you also have to emphasize repetition. In Japanese, the kihon, the basic movement. And in Japanese sword arts, this is almost unheard of. I mean, people will do forms. Obviously in Kendo, there's a huge amount of practice of repetition of basic movements and cuts and strikes. But in those who are using real swords and using forms, they will go through the forms, but they won't stand in a stance and practice over and over again the basic movements. They won't use the uchikomi stand like the pel and do repeated blows to it, which seems to me to be a huge mistake.
I'd agree. I'm very surprised to hear that. I mean, I as I say, I don't know the first thing about Japanese swordsmanship, but certainly from where we come from, that's a very important part of the training. In Italian, there's a term, sprezzatura. Sprezzatura, it refers to doing something very difficult and making it look effortless when you do so. Ballet is a perfect example of this.
Mm-hmm.
If you had never seen ballet before, and then you see dancers come onto stage and you watch it, you think, I can do that. It's just people fluttering around on tiptoes, kicking occasionally. Anybody can do that until you try it. And suddenly you realize that it's actually very, very hard. And now trying to put these actions together correctly, for example, into a form, and doing it fluidly, requires constant repetition of all the basic movements. Forms are they're sequences of techniques, and techniques are just principles in action, and principles are practiced through repetition. So if you're practicing the forms and you're practicing them without that base understanding of the principles, how can your forms ever be correct?
There is one school, the Jigen Ryu, that was the sort of style of the Satsuma Han, who were involved in the big rebellion against the new modern Japanese state. And they were the most feared fighters for several hundred years in that later period. And their main practice was hitting the target. Although, if you look at how they're doing hitting the target now, it's a complete nonsense. Definitely they were doing the practice. Yeah. Now if you look at them, they're just hitting with the hands. It's not training that whole body involvement, which is important not because it transmits more power, but because psychologically that allows you to operate in those kind of in extremis.
When we're training drills in the hall, obviously we're not actually hitting each other, because even in a drill you don't want to hurt your opponent, so you'll pull short. But it's important to then still to make contact, to train yourself to make that contact, because otherwise you're teaching yourself to stop short and to not strike the target. Whether you're competing, or I imagine if you were to be actually fighting with a sword, the last thing you want to do is for your subconscious to say, this is the part where I hold back.
Underneath my master was a very, very good teacher, who was a very, in some ways, nasty and difficult kind of human being. But practicing those forms with him was always a kind of an education. He was of a new generation, so a lot of them, not just my master, but quite a few of the seniors were all ex-military. But he'd been a karate teacher and a street fighter, and he had this very strong desire to kill somebody in order to, to test to see if he'd really got the thing that his master had. So when you were training with him, you felt this. It was quite kind of very, very intimidating. But also because of he had a very good imagination, and the thing I was talking earlier about the imagination. He was creating that reality, and he also was very clear about the difference, being conscious of the difference between what you were doing and what you would do if it was for real. Whereas lots of people just mechanically go through these things. And at that time, there were two seniors, they used to do all the demonstrations, and they would do all these demonstrations with live blades, which we're not allowed to do in the association now.
When you watch things like machete duels in Brazil, or recently there was some horrific YouTube video where some lunatics in Germany decided to try sparring with live longswords. Even though it's not something pleasant to watch, one thing you do notice is the difference in measure when you engage. People are standing much further away from each other than they would be in a tournament setting.
Yes.
So, although when you know that you're safe, you might encroach closer on your opponent or training partner, but when you're holding a real sharp blade in front of someone, they want to get so far out of wide measure, which is the measure where it takes a step to reach the opponent, that the opponent can't just step in and reach you. They have to actually chase you up in order to reach you to engage with you.
In Kendo, they talk about the three measures. So you've got Chuma, which is the middle distance, or Issoku Itonoma, which means one step, one cut. And then you have Chikama, which is closer than that, anything closer than that, and Toma, which is anything further apart. In the Kumitachi kata, it's very important to recognize when you come into that zone. The other thing about the Kumitachi partnered forms is that they're a kind of practice, but they're also a kind of demonstration. You're trying to show other people or show other students, when you go through your solo forms, you are being this person in this situation. You're trying to teach through it. It's very important that suddenly the atmosphere should change. And that's something I'm really stress. And when you look at, for example, modern Kendo, most of the time it's young, very fast guys coming inside that range and basically using arm power, which, as I said earlier, is something that won't operate for you in a situation of stress. And actually, in reality, you're not going to get that close, because if you're both thinking clearly and you've both got live blades, you only go into that zone when you've got some overriding compulsion or recognition. Otherwise you're going to stay out.
Oh, exactly.
I don't know if you've seen the film Rashomon.
I think so, but you'll have to remind me. I recognise the name.
So it's a Kurosawa movie in which three characters describe the same event, but in completely different ways, because of the way that they, their distorted perception or the agenda they have. And this involves a fight between this high-ranking samurai, older man, and a young I think he's a criminal vagabond. And the portrayal, which is, as we see these different narratives, it becomes clear which is the most reliable. So the most reliable narrative is one in which these two guys kind of posture at range and looking very nervous and jumping around and never getting close to each other until, I can't remember now, but one falls over and then the other one jumps in. Nakamura Sensei was a military combat instructor. They were all trained at the Toyama Army School. There was also a naval school which also taught military swordsmanship. It went through various stages, but at each stage some of the most senior and highly respected kendo and real sword masters came together and selected a number of simpler forms that would serve as the syllabus. So that was what he primarily taught and practiced in the army. They were derived from classical forms, but radically simplified. And on the basis of his experiences and the experiences of other people in combat, they then revised some of those basic techniques. So, for example, the main technique was the vertical downward cut, but in combat, it's the diagonal cut that's most effective and accessible. So he switched a lot of the cuts to the diagonal cut. He changed the emphasis from the syllabus being a set of specific forms to a set of basic techniques, of which those forms were just examples of how those techniques might be put together, which sounds kind of more like a sort of philosophical difference, but it's, you know, in terms of the actual training, then there was more training of individual techniques, of repetition. Also the introduction of the cutting techniques, which they had used in the military swordsmanship as a way, rather like, you know, in modern armies have used bayonet training and actually thrusting into a target as a way of breaking through the aversion to killing, to developing, overcoming that aversion. So cutting was used for that reason, but also because as you're cutting, then the individual techniques have to then be practiced. This original set of kata in various formats was called the Toyama kata, because they'd been taught, they'd been brought together for the purpose of instruction at the Toyama Military Academy. He then felt that other techniques needed to be brought in, so he devised his own set of forms, which were then became the Nakamura school, the Dento Maki, so the scroll in which the techniques of that school are written down. It's called the Happo Giri Toho, so which is the sword method of the 8 cuts or 8 techniques. Essentially, this is true with any kind of bladed weapon. You basically have a thrust, a vertical cut down, diagonal left right, diagonal right left, and then the side cuts right left, left right, and that makes up your 8 techniques. So his approach was how you can put these techniques together. So you learn these techniques, how you can spontaneously, with ease, move from one technique to another. And this is more in a situation like a melee, where you have multiple opponents. So one cut leads to another cut, yes, through these various circular movements. And that was what, in his own swordsmanship, he kind of naturally gave rise to through his particular physical abilities.
It's fascinating because you've just described exactly the same process that we practice. There's a few more cuts because you have the false edge cuts as well, not just with the front edge. But in exactly the same way that you described, every cut originates from a guard. Every cut ends in another guard. And it's about how to fluidly move between the guards each time with another cut. And this is different from other swordsmanship schools.
Yes. Nakamura Sensei had a very low opinion of nearly every traditional school of Japanese swordsmanship. He thought they were full of unrealistic techniques, superfluous techniques, and most of them performed really poorly. Since my master died, you can see how fast something can change. You were saying, you know, a lot of the systems that you're studying have not been physically practiced for many years, maybe centuries. And that therefore the Japanese systems may have something instructive is because they were used in battle 100 years ago, 150 years ago. But from my experience, in 5 years you can lose it. One of the things that my master was very, very exacting about was about the weight of the weapon. You know, when you're actually cutting, not your training pole. So even among his most senior representatives, or the senior representatives, lots of them still use very heavy swords. And the reason for that is that then the weight of the sword does the cutting. In the States, for example, where most of the cutting goes on in the Japanese sword arts, the swords are made in that way, the technique has evolved that way, and their ability to wield the sword has proportionately reduced because of that emphasis.
I always find it curious when people have one sword for forms, one sword for cutting, and things like that. Surely you'd want to be training using something that's balanced the same.
Yeah. In Japan, there is a lot of language about the center, the core. There's a particular expression that's used, the tanden, which is like a kind of point which you visualize 3 or 4 finger widths below your navel and in close to the spine. Various teachers of psychophysical training have gone on to elaborate it in terms of like a kind of a sphere inside, like a ball, which is like a ball under pressure. The stronger you can make that presence, whatever it is, inside, and the more amenable the rest of your body you can make to that, the more you are able to move spontaneously from between these different techniques. And this is what my master had. But as I look back, looking through the people I saw who were training with him, I've only seen one person who was anywhere near his kind of total, skill set in terms of, what was going on inside him and in his sort of abilities. And largely because even that teacher did not have the kind of spontaneity, by which I mean the ability to move from one, with absolute seamlessly from one cut to another cut.
Agrippa talks of movement in spheres. So he compares a human being to a ball. Now when an attack is coming in, you need to be able to rotate the sphere to dissipate the force of the attack.
That is very much the theory behind Aikido.
Yes, but I'm not just talking about dissipation of force, but the generation of force.
Yes. Aikido essentially is drawn from the sword cut movements. I mean, nowadays in Japanese martial arts, a lot of people will do judo or karate or some other sort of thing and then finally think, well, I'd better learn the sword now because that's what Japanese martial arts is all about. Right. But in terms of those kind of unarmed systems and the kinds of ways that the movements have developed, it's clear that the sword was the first training, and then that gave you access to those, if you like, the spheres. So as you say, it's not just how you take the force, but also how the force is generated. And this is very much a part of the Nakamura's system, which is the Enke-sen, which literally just means a circular line. Those circular lines in these different planes, which are created by these different sword techniques, are the outcome of this inner sphere operating through the limbs, unhindered by the blocks of muscle in shoulders. Well, I mean, that's the number one obstacle area for most people, especially men. Alongside the system that I teach from my master, I have another system of body and mental training, which is based on what I learnt from my Yamabushi teacher and the Vajrayana teachings, and it's based on this mandala. So for each Dan grade, they work through one aspect. The point about the training is to fully integrate the limbs with the core, but it's also you're integrating the different parts of the brain. And that's what I'm most interested in now, is the kind of detail of that. And I found a huge amount of information in the neurology that's associated with the trauma therapy, because when people are traumatized through abuse or through combat veterans, the ways in which these different areas of the brain operate is, well, first of all, lots of parts of the brain are accessed in the most hugely powerful ways, as a result of which the whole system breaks down, or whole areas then get completely closed off. A bit like, like the freezing that occurs in situations of great stress, or you have that kind of hysteria. Also, in terms of what happens to people afterwards over a long period of time, some will become, hypervigilant all the time and have constant reenactments internally of the situation and lose control of all kinds of emotional triggers, whereas other people will close down in all sorts of ways. So whole areas of the kind of psyche get absolutely blocked out.
And by performing these exercises, you can reconnect.
Yes. Well, given that I see most of the Japanese swords scene as being people flailing around, trying to, standing close to a target using a top-weighted sword and doing very fast movements to do multiple cuts on one target, I certainly don't think the Japanese swords scene has much to, as a whole, is in a position to say anything to anybody else. It's kind of built in. We do this bow to the sword at the beginning of the training. And if you've been practicing with a non-live blade, a training sword, and then you move to the cutting, when you take the sword again, you do this, you go through this ritual gesture. The most important reason for that is to try to engender that kind of respect. We'll regularly have, say, like 4 or 5 cutting stations and groups of people. Then when you pass a sword from one person to another, a whole series of kind of rules and regulations. So each stand has a supervisor who is watching what's going on. And then the person who's supervising the whole group, the most important thing is to watch the fatigue. On a couple of occasions, we nearly had a very bad accident. In retrospect, I realised I'd noticed that people were beginning to, like one, it was a very hot day and we'd been going at it for about 3 hours and there'd been a 2-hour class before that. So now as soon as I kind of feel that vibe, we stop.
And you think the rituals, the sequence at a cutting event helps facilitate safety as well?
Yeah. Before anyone is allowed to cut, they have to demonstrate that they can stop the sword completely dead at the end, at the correct position. The trajectory is roughly correct, but the most important thing is that they can stop it securely. That's not just a question of tenouchi, in terms of the gripping, but also in terms of how they're positioned so that they are balanced, they're secure. So anybody who doesn't cut like that is told to stop and to get it until they can get it right.
The way it's described in a 15th century Italian text is that the blow should stop around the level of the knee. It shouldn't go any further than that because the recovery from then is too slow, and because you might lose control or strike the ground or anything like that.
Most EI schools, which, where they're using a bladed weapon, a bladed sword, and going through solo drills, their Keisagiri, for example, finishes at horizontal. But when you actually cut, you realize that doesn't work. You have to go through the target. And initially, anyway, all the basic downward cuts are brought right in until your left wrist is pressing into your lower abdomen. And if the grip is correct, the tip is going to be level with the knee. If it's lower than that, then you're losing control. Or you've already lost control. You've got this kind of situation going on where you are not in control of the sword anymore if that's happened to your wrist. The Japanese cutting tournaments have now been going on for probably 50 years. The judging guidelines in our particular association, which is the kind of oldest one for doing these tournaments, it's very easy to mark the cut. The angle, the cleanness so it's not scooped, the distance between cuts, whether the target moves or not, whether the cut piece is moving a long way away, because the longer the piece is moving away, the worse the cut was. It should just drop down on either side. These things are always easy, or all easy to cut, all easy to judge. But my sort of senior and Nakamura Sensei, the master, were both very aware of the other things like intent. Are you just cutting a bit of mat, or is this a killing blow? Are you totally secure at the end? Is your movement in a movement that you could do when there was actually somebody there waiting to receive the blow, or not? If there was a living target. And it seems to me all those things must be part of the judging. And if some of those are part of the judging, then it's going to stop people doing some of the things you talk about because they won't get good marks. Just the fact they cut, 0 marks.
Speaking to John, it became clear that the problems I see in modern swordsmanship are not unique to the European scene. Competing or sparring in a safe environment is one thing, but what is the purpose in being able to reach out and touch an opponent if you're unable to cut them effectively? And what constitutes an effective cut in an active environment? It's easy to envisage oneself acting in a crisis, but what does it really take to break through one's hesitation in a split second of opportunity? The old masters speak of cutting and stepping being inextricably linked, which may relate to the movement of the legs activating the swordsman out of passivity. John's description of spirituality did not seem based in religious observation so much as in a pragmatic philosophy of critical self-assessment. I'm curious to know more about the mindset cultivated by those expected to wield a sword in earnest, but that is for a later video. If you would like to join me on this journey, please click on the subscribe button and the bell icon below so that you can be notified at the correct time.